Welcome back. So fascinating stuff going on here. Cardinal Fernandez with the Vatican's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith dropped a bombshell on the SSPX during their negotiations, which only came out from the side of the SSPX that told the story of how the recent meeting between the Vatican and the SSPX went down. We took a look at previously what the Vatican said about that meeting. Now we're going to see what the SSPX said about the meeting, and in it are some extra details that, wow, caught me by surprise with some of the things that Cardinal Fernandez was saying, specifically about the Second Vatican Council. So I want to talk about that. But, before I dive into the question, I just have to make y'all aware of something that I just started today, and that is a course that we're going to be doing in 2 weeks, 3 lectures on the SSPX, Crisis and Communion, understanding the Vatican-SSPX relationship. So if you want to understand the history between Rome and the SSPX, the theological discussions and differences, and also what needs to happen in order for there to be reconciliation. If you're confused about the question, you don't know why there's this big deal between Rome and the SSPX, I'm going to cover everything you need to know about the history, the theology, and how to move forward in this particular situation. So go and check it out, rtcourses.com, and just scroll down. You'll see my Magisterial Studies bundle right here, but right underneath it is the monthly lecture series. Click on Crisis and Communion, Understanding the Vatican-SSPX Relationship. Go ahead and reserve your spot today. As soon as you do that, you'll also get 50% off my Magisterial Studies bundle, which are the lectures I offer on the magisterium at the university level, and something that's really related to our question today. Can Catholic doctrine change? I did a whole lecture, actually multiple lectures on that 2 months ago. Can Catholic doctrine change? Exploring the possibility of doctrinal reversals. Once you purchase that SSPX course, you'll get 75% off that course. So take advantage of that discount while it lasts. Okay, so rtcourses.com, go and check that out. Reserve your spot. Let's dive into the topic of today. I was taken back when I read this, and I thought, there's no way that was said. And I went and actually looked at the communique from the SSPX, and they are saying that Cardinal Fernandez told them explicitly, while it would be possible to engage in dialogue about the Second Vatican Council, its texts could not be corrected. Okay, that right there, little bit of a surprise to see Cardinal Fernandez saying that. And let me explain why. We've seen discussions between the Vatican and SSPX for decades. It's always surrounding the Second Vatican Council, because the differences between Rome and the SSPX is not just the liturgy, it's not just the Latin Mass, it's always been the Second Vatican Council. Just read anything from Marcel Lefebvre, who actually was at the Second Vatican Council and voted in favor of all the documents. Later on, he repudiated the council and accused it of error. He even has a book accusing the council by that title, I Accuse the Council. And he accused it of teaching errors. And so some in the society believe these are just errors. Others think it taught heresy, but nonetheless, they have disputes that are theological in nature with Vatican II, which is why when Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunication of the 4 bishops that Marcel Lefebvre illicitly consecrated, he explicitly says in that letter that the doctrinal differences between the society and Rome still remain. What doctrinal differences are they talking about? Vatican II. Religious liberty, collegiality, those are big ones. And not just limited to those, right? The reason why is, if you look at some of the popes and their teachings prior to Vatican II, what they taught about, for example, religious liberty, a lot of people feel is in conflict with what Vatican II taught. And these aren't just random people. Believe it or not, one of the biggest proponents of that idea was Pope Benedict XVI. He actually is the one who said that, yeah, there is a effectively contradiction between what some of these popes said and what Vatican II taught. And Vatican II corrected those previous popes. You don't believe me? I'll show it to you in just a moment. And that wasn't unique to him at one time period. He said it when he was younger. He also said it when he was pope. That may come as a surprise to people. What are you talking about? Teachings of popes can be corrected? That's what Pope Benedict XVI says. It shouldn't come as a surprise, because if you watch this show frequently, we often talk about doctrinal reversals, because that's the subject of my doctoral dissertation. So I find it especially interesting. Now, Fernandez is saying Vatican II cannot be corrected. Now, let me just attempt to be charitable here. Maybe what he means is just rhetorical, like it can't be corrected as far as we're not willing to have that conversation kind of statement. I don't know if that's what he means, or if he means it can't be corrected as in, like, objectively speaking, Vatican II is irreformable in nature. Its teachings are infallible, and therefore they cannot ever be corrected. If that is what he means, that's a position that, to my knowledge, no pope has taken. Popes have actually implied the opposite. And it just wouldn't even make sense, because you would have to ask the question, when did Vatican II teach definitively? There is one exception that we'll talk about here in a moment. Paragraph 21 of Lumen Gentium, that a lot of theologians argue is an infallible teaching of Vatican II. But other than that, it's very clear cut, and it's always been understood that Vatican II was never exercising a charism of infallibility, aside from maybe one particular instance. And if that's the case, there's no way to say it can't be corrected, because by definition, if something doesn't have that character of being irreformable and infallible, then by definition, it can be corrected. It doesn't mean it will be. It just means it could potentially be, theoretically. Now, I want to examine this question. Now, in this video, I'm not weighing in on the question of whether or not the society is right or wrong on Vatican II and the points that are in dispute. We've explored that in other videos, and we can talk about that more in other videos, and we'll definitely be covering that in the course that I'm offering on the SSPX. But that's a different issue. I just want to consider the question of, can Vatican II be considered as this idea of, its teachings cannot be corrected, they're irreformable, they're infallible? Or is actually Cardinal Fernandez in error here, if what he means is that the teachings themselves cannot be corrected, and he's not just speaking rhetorically here? I have to assume that he's not just speaking rhetorically, that he really believes that it's a non-negotiable. Like every single teaching of Vatican II are non-negotiables. They can't be corrected. If that's what is meant, then there could be some difficulties here. So now let me share my screen, and let's go ahead and take a look at some of these things. And let me, of course, give terminology, right? And this is terminology that comes directly from Fernandez's dicastery before he was the head of the dicastery. They have confirmed that irreformable is exchangeable for infallible. It's exchangeable for definitive. And therefore, reformable means non-infallible, means non-definitive. So if you're seeing the Vatican using terminology like reformable, the opposite is irreformable. But those are also synonyms for infallible versus non-infallible, definitive versus non-definitive. And if we're talking about things that can be reformed, we are talking about things that can be corrected by definition. By definition. If it's reformable, it can be corrected. If it's non-infallible, it can be corrected. If it's non-definitive, it can be corrected. So now that we have the terminology out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look. By the way, this is a slide from my lecture that I offered 2 months ago called Can Catholic Doctrine Change? It's over again at rtcourses.com. If you just scroll down here, you'll find it right here. Can Catholic Doctrine Change? So this is a slide from that lecture. Cardinal Ratzinger, at the time he was Father Ratzinger. Well, no, I'm sorry. At this time he was Pope Benedict. This is from his Christmas greetings to the cardinals in Rome in 2005. So this is him speaking when he was Pope. And you've probably heard of him talking about the hermeneutic of continuity. You ever heard of that? This is that address. Okay, this is that address that he delivered and spoke about continuity versus reform. He says outright, quote, "The Second Vatican Council, with its new definition on the relationship between faith and the church and certain essential elements of modern thought, has reviewed or even corrected," there's that word, corrected, same term that Fernandez used, corrected certain historical decisions. What decisions is he talking about? Well, in the context, he's talking about teachings on religious liberty. So he's saying that Vatican II corrected some of the teachings of Pope Leo XIII, Gregory XVI. He argues that Vatican II reversed those teachings. Now, you might not agree with Pope Benedict XVI, but that's his position. He believes they've been reversed. Now, he says, corrected certain historical decisions, but in this apparent discontinuity, it has actually preserved and deepened her innermost nature and true identity. So he believes though there was a reversal, by reversing these teachings of these popes, they're actually going back to something that's more in continuity with the core teachings of Christianity. That's why he speaks of reform and continuity. But here he's very explicit, right? Corrected certain historical decisions in the context of papal teachings. That's not unique to him. Numerous other theologians have said and argued the exact same thing. Lefebvre argued the exact same thing, by the way. Not just Pope Benedict XVI, but Lefebvre took that position, despite Lefebvre having actually signed that document. And we do have his signature on that document. Okay, but I want to show you something else. I pointed this out in the same lecture. This is from a young Cardinal Ratzinger who was at Vatican II as a theological advisor to his bishop. And this is him writing after the council, talking about the text on religious liberty, the very thing that Pope Benedict was speaking about later in the Christmas address. And here he says that the document itself has a contradiction and flaws in it, basically errors in it, and that the document itself reversed some of the teachings of previous popes. And I want to tell you why that's important in a second, but let me just read it to you so you know I'm not making this up. He says the text attempts to emphasize continuity in the statements of the official church on this issue. It also says that it leaves intact the traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and communities towards the true religion and the only Church of Christ. That's paragraph 1. The term duty here has doubtful application to communities in their relation to the church. Later on in the declaration, the text itself corrects, there's that word again that Fernandez used, corrects and modifies these earlier statements, offering something new, something that is quite different than what is found, for example, in the statements of Pius XI, Pius XII. So he's saying that those teachings of Pius XI, Pius XII, among others, Vatican II is correcting them. It's reversing them. And he says the idea that, the church is leaving intact the traditional Catholic doctrine, he calls that actually a flaw in the document, an error, a mistake. He says it would have been better to omit these compromising formulas or to reformulate them in line with the later text. Thus, the introduction changes nothing to the text content. Therefore, we need not regard it as anything more than a minor flaw. He's just outright saying there's an error in Vatican II's document on religious liberty when it claims that it's in continuity with the previous popes. He's saying, no, it's not. It's clearly not. He's saying that's clearly an error. And the way it works is they have running documents and they'll make a change here, make a change there, make a change there, make a change here and there. And he's saying, this portion is added, that portion is taken away. That he's saying by the end of that construction process, there's actually contradictions within the text. Now, again, you may disagree with him, but the point is, he's outright saying Vatican II corrected some of these other popes in their teachings. Why am I bringing this up? And by the way, if you might say, well, that's when he was young. He was a young Ratzinger at the time. I literally just showed you Pope Benedict XVI said the exact same thing. So you can't say, that was in his younger days. He said it in his later days as Pope right before he died. Maybe about 10 years before he died. It's not a young Ratzinger thing. He maintained that position all along, never repudiated it, never said that he takes a different position. He continued to double down on that position, so you can't dismiss it. Okay? Now, you might disagree with him, but you can't argue that he changed his mind. He never changed his mind. Why am I saying this? Why am I bringing this up? Because the point is, well, Michael, you're saying that he's saying that Vatican II corrected some of these other popes in their teachings. What does that have to do with whether or not Vatican II can be corrected? Whether Vatican II can be changed? If those other popes cannot be corrected, then Vatican II was in no position to correct them either, right? But if you're going to say, okay, Vatican II could correct those other popes because those other popes were teaching non-infallibly, bingo. Wasn't Vatican II also teaching non-infallibly? Yeah, it was, at least in 99% of the cases. So in those 99% of the cases, how can you speak of them being unable to be corrected or changed when, if that's true, then none of the other teachings prior to Vatican II could also change? And that actually falls into the hands of the SSPX's position, because they're going to say, wait, if teaching and doctrine can't change, you're on our side. We're saying Vatican II is wrong because it changed doctrine. So you're playing right into the hands of the SSPX when you take that position. You just don't realize it yet. You just haven't connected the dots yet. Which is why, again, with all due respect, I partly feel this is one of the reasons why I'm not sure Cardinal Fernandez is the guy to do this negotiation with the SSPX. I think that anybody who knows the Magisterium very well could eat his lunch on that statement. And, I'm sure they got somebody at the SSPX who could probably correct him on this particular point. It would actually show how this point undermines Rome's position. If you're going to say Vatican II can reform previous teachings of popes, you have to be able to acknowledge Vatican II itself can be reformed. I'm not saying it should be. I'm not saying it will be. But what I'm saying is you can't take the position that it's irreformable while saying that the other popes are reformable in nature when they're effectively in the same category of teaching level. Now, how do we know that? Well, let's discuss what the Magisterium itself says. In the profession of faith after the Nicene Creed, there's an affirmation of all dogmas, paragraph 1, and an affirmation of all definitive Catholic doctrine, paragraph 2, and then an affirmation of teachings that are non-infallible in nature, paragraph 3. Moreover, I adhere with religious submission of will and intellect to the teachings which either the Pope or the College of Bishops enunciate when they exercise their authentic magisterium, even if they do not intend to proclaim these teachings by a definitive act. So they're talking about teachings that are non-definitive in nature. The dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, Fernandez's own dicastery, has explained the term definitive is exchangeable with irreformable and infallible. Ergo, non-definitive, non-infallible, non-irreformable. So if something is not definitive, according to the congregation that Fernandez is at itself, that means it's a non-infallible teaching. Okay, now let me ask you a question. Can non-infallible teachings in theory be reversed? In theory. I'm not saying they will, but in theory. Yes, by definition. By definition. If you're saying non-infallible cannot be reversed or reformed or corrected or contradicted, whatever term you want to use, you're saying it is infallible. That's what you're saying. So it becomes nonsensical to even use the term non-infallible if you think its teachings can never be reformed. By definition, it could be reformed. When Vatican II teaches, which category of teachings are the vast majority of its teachings? Paragraph 1, dogmas. Paragraph 2, definitive Catholic doctrine, or paragraph 3, non-definitive Catholic doctrine? Okay, for the vast majority of cases, paragraph 3 is the level of teaching. Now, you might argue it's really high in that spectrum of non-infallible teachings because a lot of popes were there. I'm sorry, well, 2 popes were there. A lot of bishops were there, and multiple popes have confirmed it since then. Sure, you might argue it's like really, really high in that category of the 3rd tier, of course. But it's still in that 3rd tier. It's not in the 2nd tier or 1st tier of infallible doctrine. How do I know that? Well, first of all, we have Pope Paul VI who tells us that. There are those who ask what authority, what theological qualification the council intended to give it to its teachings, knowing that it avoided issuing solemn dogmatic definitions. Those are your first paragraph teachings. Dogmatic definitions engaging the infallibility of the ecclesial magisterium. The answer is known by whoever remembers the Conciliar Declaration in 1964. Given the council's pastoral character, it avoided pronouncing in an extraordinary manner dogmas endowed with the note of infallibility. Now, he's talking about dogmas specifically, paragraph 1, right? So he's saying there's no dogmas there. All right, so we got to X that one out, which wasn't a shocker anyway, because it's clear there's no new dogmas there. So X paragraph 1 teachings out. What's left? You have paragraph 2, paragraph 3, right? Now, can paragraph 2 teachings be reformed? No, by definition, they cannot, because they're infallible Catholic teachings. They cannot be reformed. So if there's any teachings in that 2nd category, those cannot be changed. Are there any? Some theologians would argue there's one at Vatican II that's in that 2nd tier, and that is the sacramentality of the episcopate in Lumen Gentium 21. Something I've spoken about before many, many times. But yeah, I could see a strong argument to say that that's like an infallible teaching of Vatican II in that 2nd tier, definitive Catholic doctrine. But that's one example out of 16 documents. You have 16 documents, and every other paragraph is not asserting new infallible definitive Catholic doctrine. So that would be one minor exception. Everything else then falls into what tier? That 3rd tier, non-definitive Catholic doctrine that can theoretically be reformed. So in what way could Cardinal Fernandez be correct when he says its text could not be corrected? Well, not in any real strict sense. That's 100% not true. But maybe he just means its text could not be corrected. That is, we're not willing to correct it. But if we're just talking about objectively and theoretically, actually almost all of it could be. Not that it will, not that it should, but it could. And you have to recognize that distinction because it does play into the conversation between Rome and the Vatican. It 100% does. Because you do want to assert and reaffirm Donum Veritatis from the very congregation that Fernandez is head of, that talks about rare cases that you can withhold assent from those non-infallible teachings. Those are rare cases that could apply to some situations with Vatican II. That's a bone you could throw to the SSPX as the head of the dicastery. But you can't do that if you're telling them that nothing can be corrected here. You can't throw them the bone that actually the Vatican has already thrown them in Donum Veritatis. This is why I say I don't know if he's the right guy to do this, but aside from, again, the fact that paragraph 31 and 30 in Donum Veritatis talk about those rare cases where you can withhold assent from those 3rd tier non-infallible teachings, I'll point to paragraph 24 that it actually talks about the contents of magisterial interventions being corrected. It says the willingness to submit loyally to the teachings of the magisterium on matters per se not irreformable must be the rule. So it's acknowledging there are some teachings of the magisterium that are reformable in nature. The willingness to submit loyally to the teaching of the magisterium on matters per se not irreformable. This is a magisterial document. This is 100% magisterial, telling you there are teachings that can be reformed. Right there. It's right there. It can happen, however, that the theologian may according to the case, raise questions regarding the timeliness, the form, or even the contents of magisterial interventions. And he's not just talking about disciplinary interventions. He's talking about teachings of the magisterium right there. Okay, so it's saying, yes, some of the teachings could be reformed. If it's reformed, yes, technically it could be an error. It could be corrected. So when Fernandez says its text could not be corrected, there's no way to say that from a Catholic perspective. There's no way to say that, ironically, as the head of the very dicastery that has said the opposite. There's no way to say that as the successor of Ratzinger in that office, who has said the exact opposite. I don't know what he's thinking here. Now, again, I encourage all of you to go and read Dona Veritatis, especially that paragraph, but also paragraph, like I said, 31. It can also happen that after serious study and the desire to follow the magisterium, but with deep concerns and an inability to see how the teaching is correct, if a theologian feels he cannot give his intellectual assent to these non-infallible teachings, the theologian nevertheless has the duty to remain open to a deeper examination of the question. There's a bone you could throw as the head of the dicastery. Like Fernandez needs to throw that bone to the SSPX and say, okay, look, when you say, you can't accept Vatican II at all, if you're going to take that position, well, no, we can't go there. But if you're going to take the position that in some cases you feel that there's a conflict between the teaching of Vatican II and some of the preconciliar popes, say on religious liberty, you could, in good conscience, under these conditions, withhold assent. That's something he could share with them. That's a bone he could throw to them. Now, is that actually going to be good enough for most in the society? That's a different question, but it is a start. It is a place to start. But you can't start there when you're starting a discussion telling people that Vatican II can't be corrected. No, what are you doing here? We're going too far. We're overplaying our hand here when we make those kinds of statements. Don't do that. Now, I think it would be absurd if, the church ever came out and said the whole thing, all of Vatican II needs to be corrected. Well, gosh, if the whole thing was wrong, I think that causes deeper problems, right? But if one is just talking about like particular parts, particular teachings, particular portions, if one is saying something like that could be adjusted or corrected, that's already right there within the text of the magisterium as far as the possibility. And I think that needs to be highlighted in those negotiations with SSPX. I don't know if it's going to, because I'm not part of those negotiations. Nobody asked me to be part of it, right? So I'm just over here telling y'all about it just from where I sit. I don't know if somebody in the dicastery is going to point that out to the SSPX and if they're going to have that conversation, or if it would really be sufficient to ease some of the tensions. Again, I want y'all to go to rtcourses.com, check out Crisis and Communion, Understanding the Vatican-SSPX Relationship. That's a course I'm going to be delivering on everything you need to know about the Vatican and its relationship and theological discussions with the SSPX 3 1-hour lectures that we're going to have in 2 weeks on Saturday, 12 p.m. Central on February 28th. And then once you purchase access to it, you'll always have access to it. So even if you can't attend live, you'll always have access to it. But try to attend live because you can ask questions at the end. And, once you make that purchase, you also get discounts on everything else, the Magisterial Studies program, the other courses, Magisterial Difficulties, Can Catholic Doctrine Change, Understanding Papal Infallibility. All of those, I think, are going to be very beneficial to you if you're interested in this conversation about Vatican II, Can Doctrine Change, the SSPX, and differences with the Vatican and SSPX. You're going to want to check all of that out. So, anyways, those are my thoughts on the matter. I hope you found it helpful. Thank y'all so much for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate your support. God bless you all. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And if you want to support my work, check me at patreon.com/Reason of Theology. Also, check out my second channel, Knowledge and Wisdom, right here on YouTube.